Hi again, everybody. It's Tracy from Angular at Work. In today's Angular at Work how-to video, I'll be showing you how to create a custom tooltip. Let's first take a look at what we'll be creating. If I hover over this information icon in the heading, notice we get a custom tooltip with a black background and white text, and it also has a triangular pointer to the tooltip icon, and the cursor also turns into this help cursor. Now I'm going to show you a couple of variations on the tooltip, one being the tooltip on an icon, and this is a Font Awesome icon, and another being a tooltip on a word. And notice this word is underlined. It's got a gray underline, but it too has a tooltip message that has a black background and white text with a triangular pointer, and the cursor turns into this help cursor with a question mark. And lastly, another variation is a tooltip that has neither an icon or an underline. And what this allows you to do is to customize the tooltip as you see fit with whatever decoration that you see fit. Now let's take a look at the code that creates this custom tooltip. And notice the tooltip component is a standalone component, and there's also a directive, and the directive is used to contain the tooltip message. And this is all of the component code that makes up the custom tooltip. Now let's take a look at the template code for the tooltip component. And notice we are using content projection. We have two elements that are being projected into the tooltip component. There is the tooltip message that you see on line 3, and that content is being projected into a span which has the class tooltip. And on line 1, we see that everything else is being projected into the top. So that's all of the template code. So as you can see, the tooltip component code and template code, it's very minimal. The real magic for the tooltip component is actually in the CSS. So let's take a look at that. To style this tooltip component, this custom tooltip component, I use SCSS, and I use Sass partials instead of raw CSS files. For the tooltip component, I created two partials, _tooltip.scss and _globals.scss. First, let's take a look at the _tooltip.css file, because that's where the bulk of the styling code is. So notice there is a selector for a tooltip class, and this tooltip class is actually the container for the tooltip, so that you can better see what this tooltip declaration produces. I'm going to change this one property, the opacity, to use instead of 0, I'm going to change it to 0.1. And now if we look at the browser, we see all of the tooltip containers and messages very faintly, but we can indeed see them. So let's take a look at the property settings for the tooltip class. The black background is produced by using the background color property, and the border radius is removed from the containers. And when I show you in the darker version, you'll see that all of the tooltip containers have sharp angled borders. The font color is being set to white using the color property, and the font size is set to 1.1 rem. Now I like to use, instead of pixels, I like to use relative units, either rems or ems, for things like font size and padding. The font weight for the text message for the tooltip message is normal. And this left property is used to position the tooltip container relative to the icon or word that's being used. So if I change this left property, and notice what happens to each one of the tooltip containers, if I change this left property to 0, notice that all of the tooltip containers shift to the left of either the tooltip icon or the tooltip word. I'll reset the left property back to 50%. And the line height is 1.5, which means that the line height is 1.5 times the font size. The opacity, which is initially set at 0, so that the initial state of all of the tooltips, the initial state is hidden. And if I change this to 1, which is full opacity, then we'll see all of the tooltips with the black background as well as the white text. But for now, to go through this, I'm going to return this to 0.1. The padding is set to 0.75 rem for top and bottom and 1 rem for left and right. The pointer events are set to none. The position is absolute, and we're using an absolute position because we want to position each one of the tooltip containers using their left, top, right, and or bottom properties. And in the case of this selector, we're using both left and top. And notice top is set at 200%, which shifts each of the tooltip containers down to twice the height of the actual text. The transition is using the opacity property, which is giving a little bit of an animation when we hover over the icon or the word that makes the tooltip visible. It uses the transition property to make that animation happen. The transform property is setting the translate X to minus 50%. And I'll comment this out so that you can see what happens when we don't set this property. Notice all of the containers move to the right of the icon or word. So it's a combination of the left property and the transform translate X properties that centers each of the containers directly beneath either the tooltip icon or the word. The width of each of the containers is 15 rem, and the Z index is being set to 1 so that the tooltip is always the topmost element. We use the before pseudo class so that each of the tooltip containers is actually being created before the word or the icon. But because we're using the combination of left and transform, we're getting a centering effect instead. The first 4 properties that we see in the before pseudo selector are border properties. And actually, those are not properties that control the border of the container. They're actually combined to create the little triangle pointer that you see that points upwards towards the icon or the word. So I'll comment these 4 things out and you'll be able to see that. And notice now that I've commented them out, the little triangle is gone for each of the tooltip containers. The bottom 100% positions the triangle beneath the icon or the word, and it's positioning using the font height of either the icon or the word, and it's using the full height to push that triangle downward. The content property is set to the empty string because we're not actually using any text to create the little triangle. The height is set to 0, and again, for the before pseudo class, the left and transform properties are being set to 50% and minus 50%. And because we're using the bottom and left properties for the before pseudo class, we need to set the position property to absolute. So now what I'll do is I will set the opacity back to 0 so that all of the containers are invisible. This last rule, which is selecting the host and the hover action of the host for each of the tooltip selectors, it's setting the opacity to 1. So when we hover over the tooltip, the opacity is set to 1 and the tooltip container becomes visible. And that's what is occurring at the moment. And if we set the opacity to, let's say, 0.5, the tooltips will be visible, but they'll be semi-transparent. and notice that's what's happening. So the host hover selector is activated when we hover the mouse over the host, which in this case is, of course, the tooltip itself. So I'll set this opacity back to 1. And now let's take a look at what's in the globals file. In the globals file, we have 3 different host selector variations. The first one is to produce the underlined version of the tooltip. The second one, which is being passed the tooltip icon class, is responsible for creating the tooltip that uses the font awesome icon. And the last host selector involves all of the tooltips. And this selector is what changes the cursor to the help cursor with the little question mark. And it sets the position relative to the entire host. And that's necessary because remember, back in the underscore tooltip partial, we're positioning the containers and the little triangle. We're positioning those using absolute. So the parent must contain, so the parent must be set at position relative, which indeed the host element, that's exactly what it's doing. And oh, I did forget to mention that the underlined version of the host selector, that's what creates the dotted line. In the underlined version, it places the dotted line under the word that contains the, under the word or words that contain the tooltip. And the dot tooltip icon is formatting the font awesome icon so that it is superscript and is also 75% of the font size of its parent container. So that's all of the CSS. Now let's take a look at how the tooltip is used in code. Here in the app component, we see a few variations of how the tooltip component and the tooltip message directive, how those two things are used together to produce the custom tooltip. So let's first take a look at how the tooltip icon in the heading that says heading with tooltip icon. Let's take a look at how that's produced in the app component. We see that the app tooltip element has elements projected into it. It's got first a font awesome element, and then it has the tooltip message directive. And if we look at the tooltip template code, we see where each of those items is projected. The app tooltip message is projected into the ng content element on line 3, and the font awesome icon, because it has no selector, is being projected into the ng content element with no selector. That's on line 1. Now remember that the tooltip icon class is used in the host element to superscript the icon and to also make it 75% of the inherited font size. So you can use any icon set that you like. In this case, I'm using Font Awesome, but you could also use Google icons or any other icon set. And that's the beauty of projecting the content instead of setting an actual icon from a hard-coded icon set. Because it's being projected, you can use any icon set you like. Taking a look at the underlined word version of the tooltip component, we see that the only difference between this version and the tooltip icon version is that there's no tooltip icon being projected into the tooltip element, and there is an underlined class placed on the tooltip element or the host element. And if we go back to the globals partial file, we see that the underlined class is being used in the host selector to format the projected content with a dotted dark gray bottom border. And that's exactly what we get with this variation of the tooltip. In this last usage of the app tooltip component, we see that there is neither an icon being projected into the tooltip, nor do we have the underlined class being placed on the tooltip element itself. And this allows for formatting the projected text, which is any text that's not within the tooltip message directive. So we can create our own formatting for this projected content instead of using an underline. So there you have it. This is the custom tooltip component that I created in Angular. I'll include a link to all of the code used in this video. I'll include that in the video description. And I hope that you get to use this custom tooltip in your own code and customize it and format it in any way you wish. So that's it for today's Angular at Work how-to video. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. And to stay updated on the latest content, please subscribe to the channel.